Welcome back to another episode of The Last Climb. Today, I'm exploring how four friends ignored a series of avalanche warnings, convinced they were still on the right path. In the end, one of the deadliest decisions they made was trusting a set of tire tracks that were never meant to guide them at all. It was the 14th of February, 2017. The Gallatin Range in southwestern Montana is one of the most avalanche-prone mountain regions in the American West. Sitting along the northern edge of the Yellowstone Tourism Corridor, its broad, snow-covered slopes attract visitors year-round. In mid-February, the snowpack can exceed 10 feet in depth, with heavy layers of snow often resting on weaker layers beneath. From the valley floor, the mountains look scenic and approachable. In reality, they can be extremely dangerous. It was exactly that landscape that had drawn four friends to Montana that week. At 27, Maeve Britta Eckerman was the organizer. Working remotely in brand consulting, she also spent much of her free time creating travel content built around itineraries, destination guides, and weekend trips. She had pulled together the accommodation, the driving schedule, and most of the planning. Like a lot of people who enjoy travel content, she spent time reading trail forums and watching videos from the area before the trip. By every measure she understood, she felt prepared. Of the four, Annalie Malverson brought the most outdoor experience. At 26, she was the only member of the group with meaningful winter hiking experience, having completed multiple trips in different terrain and conditions. Much of her outdoor content focused on gear, hiking, and winter travel. She owned the right equipment and was the one who assembled the group's gear list. Her experience gave her a quiet authority within the group. For Leora Faye Sundquist, 25, the trip began with a location. Most of her content revolved around photography and visually unusual destinations. She had tracked down the waterfall, built the shot list, and settled on the dates. Of everyone in the group, she seemed the most determined to actually make the trip happen. The entire trip could be traced back to a single message from Beverly Ferreira. At 24, she was the youngest of the group and the one who had originally shared the waterfall reel that started everything. She regularly created travel content highlighting destinations she thought were worth visiting. She was enthusiastic from the beginning, not simply following along with the group. She was also the least experienced outdoors. Unlike the others, she had no previous trips to compare the conditions against, which meant she tended to trust what she was feeling in the moment. The four had met through travel content collaborations several years earlier and had remained close friends long after the projects ended. In the weeks leading up to the trip, their families knew the basics. They were spending Valentine's Day weekend in Montana and expected to be home by Sunday. Beyond that, nobody had a detailed itinerary. The waterfall location stayed within the group chat, along with most of the plans they made for the mountain. None of them were serious mountaineers. The preparation had felt thorough. Annalie had put together the gear list, and everyone had followed it. Base layers, insulated mid layers, waterproof outer shells, wool socks, gaiters, snowshoes, and trekking poles. Each carried a day pack with hand warmers, a basic first aid kit, energy bars, and water. She checked the weather forecast before they left: clear skies, temperatures in the low 20s, and light wind. By the standards they understood, they were prepared. They spent weeks gathering information about this trip, which makes the missing avalanche forecast all the more surprising. That weather forecast was the last source of information they consulted before heading into the mountains. They never checked the regional avalanche forecast or contacted a local guide, outfitter, or ranger station about current conditions. None of them realized that terrain like this required another layer of preparation entirely. The primary hazard in the Gallatin Range that February was what avalanche forecasters call a persistent weak layer, a buried layer of fragile, deteriorated snow crystals that had formed weeks earlier during a stretch of cold, clear weather. During that period, surface snow had transformed into loose, angular grains that bonded poorly to one another. Later storms buried that weak layer beneath heavier, denser snow, creating a dangerous structure, a solid slab resting on an unstable foundation. The problem with the persistent weak layer is that it rarely gives any warning from the surface. A slope sitting above it can look smooth, stable, and completely safe. It can support its own weight for days or weeks without issue, but once enough stress is applied, the weak layer collapses, and the slab above it can break free all at once. Another dangerous characteristic of persistent weak layers is that they do not always fail under the first person who crosses them. Stress can build gradually with each additional load placed on the slope. Several people may cross safely before the snowpack finally reaches its breaking point. Because of that, previous safe crossings can create a false sense of security. A slope that held for one person may fail under the next. In the 72 hours before February 14th, a storm system had moved through the range and deposited several inches of fresh snow on top of an already stressed snowpack. Temperatures briefly rose the following day before dropping sharply overnight. On open slopes, the surface of the new snow refroze into a firm crust that felt solid underfoot. To anyone walking across it, the slope seemed stable, packed, supportive, and unremarkable. The dangerous conditions remained hidden underneath. They had no idea the real problem was buried beneath their feet, but then again, that's usually how these slopes look before they fall. For 11 consecutive days leading up to February 14th, the regional avalanche forecast had rated danger in the Gallatin Range as high, the second highest level on the 5-point scale. The forecast issued that morning warned of persistent weak layers, stated that human-triggered avalanches were likely, and advised against travel on or below avalanche terrain. It specifically identified open slopes between 30 and 45 degrees as the greatest concern and highlighted western aspects of the range as particularly hazardous. The bowl the group intended to cross that morning averaged 38 degrees and faced west. The forecast was publicly available, updated that morning, and written for a general audience. None of the four ever saw it. The morning of February 14th began early. Their gear had been laid out the night before, and everyone was packed before the accommodation had fully warmed up. Maeve checked the weather one final time. Still clear, still light wind, temperatures in the low 20s. Nothing about the forecast gave her pause. The planning was finished, the gear was packed, and the destination was exactly where they had planned to be for the past 6 weeks. Leora already had the shot list open on her phone, along with notes for several photos and short video clips they hoped to capture at the waterfall. Beverly had been awake before everyone else. Shortly before 8 that morning, they got into the car and left for the trailhead. The drive into the range took them along the highway that cuts through the valley floor. The mountains remained visible almost the entire way, bright against a clear winter sky and looking exactly the way they had imagined when planning the trip. About 4 miles before reaching the trailhead, they encountered a road closure barrier. An orange and white gate blocked the access road leading into the upper drainage. Attached to the barrier was a posted sign. The English text referenced road and avalanche conditions. Beneath it was a second notice in German that included the word Lawine, part of a bilingual safety initiative reflecting the large number of European winter visitors who pass through the Yellowstone corridor each season. Lawine is the German word for avalanche. None of the four knew that. Leora took a photo of the sign. The unfamiliar word stood out as an interesting detail, something foreign and vaguely official. It did not register as a warning. Nobody knew it at the time, but that sign was trying to tell them exactly what kind of day this was going to be. Fresh tire tracks continued beyond the barrier, pressed cleanly into the overnight snowfall a vehicle had passed through recently. The tracks made the road feel active, monitored, and regularly used. Combined with the lack of any mention of a closure in the trail forums Maeve had read, they made the barrier seem less like a warning and more like a temporary inconvenience. Annalie moved the barrier aside and they drove through. The tracks didn't prove the road was safe, but they certainly made it feel that way. It's hard not to take comfort from evidence that someone was there before you. They parked where the road became impassable and began getting ready. The trailhead was completely empty. There were no other vehicles, and no obvious sign of recent foot traffic beyond the road itself. On a clear Saturday in February in a popular recreation corridor, an empty trailhead might have meant something. Maeve noticed it briefly, but assumed most people simply had not arrived yet. It was a holiday weekend and they had started early. They began hiking at approximately 9 in the morning. The first section of the approach followed a drainage through a band of trees, and conditions felt close to what they had expected. The snow was manageable, the route remained easy to follow, and the pace felt comfortable. Beverly kept up without difficulty. The mood was good. They stopped briefly just inside the tree line for water, an energy bar, a few adjustments to their layers, and a handful of quick photos before continuing. The waterfall was still ahead, but the morning felt like it was unfolding exactly as planned. That changed once they emerged from the trees. The snow was deeper than it had appeared in the videos they had watched. Even with snowshoes, they occasionally broke through the wind crust. Progress became slower and more demanding. The terrain felt more exposed, the wind more noticeable, and the slope ahead steeper than it had looked from below. In several places, The snowpack produced a faint, hollow, settling sound beneath their feet as the surface compressed under load. The sound was subtle and brief. None of them recognized it as a warning sign. Without avalanche training, there wasn't much to separate it from any other noise the mountain might make. This was only the first of several warning signs that day. Beverly was the first to slow down. She stopped to drink water and mentioned that the climb felt harder than she had expected. She also remarked that the slope ahead looked steeper than it had in the videos. Annalie told her the elevation gain eased farther ahead. Maeve added that the waterfall was just beyond the next rise. Leora had already continued up the route. After a short break, Beverly adjusted her pack and kept moving. At roughly the 40-minute mark, they noticed two figures high on the open slope above the drainage. The pair were already well above the tree line and moving steadily upward. To the group, their presence felt reassuring. If conditions were genuinely dangerous, surely people would not be up there. Maeve agreed with the reasoning. Leora used it as motivation to push the pace. The group continued toward the bowl. What they could not know was that the two figures were experienced backcountry skiers who had entered from a separate ridgeline access point and were carrying avalanche safety equipment. For several minutes, the skiers had been noticing subtle warning signs beneath their skis. The snowpack felt hollow in places. Small collapses were occurring within the buried weak layer below them. Combined with the slope, angle, and aspect, those signs had already prompted a discussion about whether they should continue. Within 20 minutes of being spotted, they would decide to turn back. The instability they were detecting on the ridge above was present throughout the bowl below. It was the same weak layer, the same loaded slab, and the same surface crust concealing both. The group continued for another 10 to 15 minutes after seeing the skiers. The terrain steepened further. Beverly stopped again, hands on her knees, and breathing harder than before. She said the slope felt different from what she had imagined. Annalie told her they were almost there. Sometimes, that's how these situations unfold. Nobody notices a single obvious red flag. Instead, little doubts start appearing one at a time, and each one finds a perfectly reasonable explanation. The group waited briefly, then continued. By the time they reached the edge of the bowl, the skiers were no longer visible. They had already turned back, though nobody below noticed they were gone. If I saw other people heading the same way, I'd probably take that as a good sign too. So seeing them turn around would have meant a lot more than seeing them in the first place. Crossing the bowl offered no obvious alternative. The waterfall drainage sat beyond a broad, treeless slope roughly 300 feet across. The slope averaged 38 degrees and was bordered on both sides by dense trees that offered no practical route around it. The snow surface appeared smooth and wind-polished. Underfoot, the crust felt firm and supportive. Beverly asked whether there was another way across. Annalie studied the terrain and said she could not see a clear route through the trees. Maeve pointed out that people in the videos had crossed there. The group paused briefly at the edge of the bowl. Nothing about it looked alarming. The slope was quiet, open, and still. Leora stepped onto the slope first. The others followed. As they moved across, they naturally spread out toward the positions they wanted for their photographs. Leora headed higher on the slope in search of the best angle toward the waterfall. Beverly moved lower and slightly to her left. Maeve and Annalie crossed between them, with some distance separating each person. Without realizing it, the four were now placing weight across multiple sections of the same unstable slab at the same time. At approximately 11:40 in the morning, Leora broke through the wind crust with her left foot while repositioning on the slope. The punch-through was minor. Her foot sank roughly 8 inches into the snow beneath the crust. At nearly the same moment, Beverly, positioned lower on the slope and slightly to the side, felt a faint compression beneath her snowshoe. The snow settled with a brief, low sensation that lasted less than a second before disappearing. They didn't know it yet, but they were only seconds away from an avalanche that would separate the group in an instant. Leora pulled her foot free and took 2 more steps uphill. On the second step, a fracture line shot outward from beneath her and raced across the width of the bowl. It moved so quickly that nobody on the slope had time to understand what was happening before the mountainside began to move. The crack spread across the weak layer in less than 2 seconds. The 2 backcountry skiers on the ridge above later described hearing it as a single sharp report that echoed across the drainage. The slab that released was approximately 220 feet wide and 18 inches deep at the crown. Several hundred tons of snow broke free at once. Within seconds, it was accelerating down the 38-degree slope at roughly 40 miles per hour. From the initial fracture to the debris coming to rest at the bottom of the bowl, the entire avalanche lasted less than 30 seconds. Leora was standing near the crown when the release occurred. The slope beneath her dropped away as a single unit, and she disappeared almost immediately into the moving snow. She was carried approximately 180 feet before the avalanche came to rest. Her eventual burial depth was estimated at 4.5 feet. She was found face down with her arms at her sides, a position consistent with being carried within the body of the moving slab, rather than tumbling extensively near the surface. There was no air pocket around her face. Beverly was positioned directly below the release and absorbed the full force of the accelerating debris. She was knocked off her feet and carried the length of the runout. Near the base of the slope, the avalanche debris compressed against a buried rock shelf hidden beneath the snowpack. The force of impact against that feature caused catastrophic injuries to her chest and upper body. She came to rest beneath approximately 3 feet of compacted snow near the toe of the debris field. Annalie and Maeve were positioned mid-slope and were caught by the lateral edge of the slab as it spread outward during the release. Both were knocked down and carried. Maeve was transported toward the outer edge of the debris field and came to rest beneath approximately 2 feet of snow near a cluster of buried shrubs. The uneven surface created by those shrubs left a small void around her face. The space was limited, but it existed. Annalie was carried a shorter distance and came to rest with part of her upper body and her left arm protruding above the surface. She was pinned in place and unable to move. During transport, the force of the avalanche repeatedly drove her head into the snow surface and terrain hidden beneath it. The 2 backcountry skiers witnessed the entire release from the ridge above. One activated a personal locator device immediately. Reaching the debris field was not straightforward. The terrain between the ridge and the ball required careful travel to avoid triggering additional instability on nearby slopes. The descent took approximately 18 minutes. When they reached the avalanche path, the scale of what had occurred was immediately obvious. Above them, the crown fracture remained visible as a clean wall of snow running across the bowl. Below it stretched a massive debris field. The avalanche debris had already begun to set and harden, becoming dense and difficult to penetrate. It covered roughly 400 feet of terrain and extended across the full width of the bowl. The area was silent. Nothing was visible above the snow, except Annalie's partially exposed arm. For the skiers, any hope that this was a small slide was gone. Annalie was reached first. She was unresponsive. The injuries she sustained during transport through the avalanche had been severe. Despite immediate efforts, she never regained consciousness. Maeve was located by probe approximately 9 minutes after the skiers arrived. The small air pocket around her face had slowed the process that occurs in confined snow burials, but it could not stop it. With each breath, oxygen is consumed, while carbon dioxide accumulates in the limited space available. Loss of consciousness follows quickly. By the time she was found, she had been buried for more than 25 minutes. Avalanche survival rates declined sharply after the first 15 minutes of complete burial, particularly when no substantial air pocket is present. The 2 skiers remained on scene, systematically probing the debris field while awaiting additional rescue personnel. Leora and Beverly were not located until search teams arrived with avalanche dogs. Leora was found beneath 4.5 feet of snow, her position consistent with deep burial within the body of the slab. Beverly was located near the base of the debris field, partially beneath the buried rock shelf. The injuries to her chest and torso were consistent with a high-force impact during the final moments of the avalanche. The distress call was transmitted from the ridge at approximately 11:43 in the morning. A rescue helicopter was dispatched, but was forced to stand down within the hour as cloud cover moved into the upper drainage and visibility dropped below safe operating limits. The aircraft remained grounded for approximately 2 hours. Ground teams were dispatched at the same time, but snow drifting along the access road significantly slowed travel into the area. The first ground rescuers reached the debris field 1 hour and 52 minutes after the avalanche released. By then, the outcome everyone feared was becoming increasingly difficult to avoid. Avalanche dogs were deployed across the slide path. All 4 women were eventually located within the debris field. None were alive when reached. Recovery operations continued over 2 days. Personal belongings had been scattered across a wide section of the slope. Near the crown of the avalanche, investigators recovered a phone that appeared to have been ejected early in the slide. It contained the group's shot list, photographs from the drive that morning, and among them a clear image of the bilingual closure sign at the road barrier. The word Lewin was plainly visible in the frame. The same phone contained a short video recorded only minutes before the release. It appeared to be part of the footage they planned to capture during the hike. A second phone recovered from the debris still had the weather forecast open on the screen. The display showed clear skies and a temperature of 22 degrees. 2 cameras were also recovered. One had been destroyed during the avalanche. The other remained intact, and its memory card contained footage from the hike, including the lower approach toward the bowl. Investigators reconstructed the sequence of events using the recovered devices, GPS data from the locator beacon activated by the skiers, witness statements, and a detailed snowpack assessment conducted during recovery operations. The assessment confirmed failure on a persistent weak layer, exactly the type of instability highlighted in the regional avalanche forecast during the 11 days leading up to the incident. The fracture pattern indicated a slab release that began at a single point and propagated rapidly across the entire weak layer beneath the bowl. The coroner ultimately determined that Leora died from asphyxiation due to snow burial. Maeve's cause of death was also listed as asphyxiation due to snow burial. Investigators noted that a small air pocket had been present around her face but had not been sufficient to sustain survival until rescue arrived. Annalie's cause of death was listed as severe head trauma sustained during the movement phase of the avalanche. Beverly's cause of death was listed as traumatic injuries to the chest and torso caused by high-force impact against a buried terrain feature during the slide. Across all 4 cases, investigators noted the complete absence of avalanche rescue equipment. The group carried no avalanche beacons, probes, or shovels. None of the 4 had formal avalanche training. Avalanche beacons, probes, and shovels are considered standard equipment in avalanche terrain. They cannot prevent an avalanche, but they can dramatically reduce the time it takes to locate and excavate a buried victim. When recovery teams examined the access road, they found the closure barrier had been moved aside. Investigators later determined that the tire tracks, which had continued beyond the gate, belonged to a utility vehicle that had entered the drainage earlier that morning for an infrastructure inspection. The vehicle had already left the area before the group arrived. The operator had no idea anyone had followed the tracks beyond the closure. The barrier itself had been in place for 6 days. What makes that detail so tragic is that the tracks really did mean something, just not what the group thought they meant.